One summer, my cousins and other extended family were all at my great-grandmother's house to sort through everything that had been in storage for years. We found all these trunks of clothes, and some of the adults thought it would be fun to have the kids dress up as their ancestors and take pictures around my great-grandmother's property. She owned a modest ranch. So we all set about finding clothing for outfit us. I had already had a few brushes with femininity at this point, so I was super anxious that something was going to happen, and of course, it did. My older female cousin, let's call her Cassie, was complaining that none of my great-grandmother's clothes fit her because her boobs were too big. My great-grandmother laughed, and idly said, "Back when I was your age, I was as flat as Kitty." Which sealed my fate, because then Cassie, my great-grandmother, and my great-aunt, Auntie Lee, for the purposes of this retelling, pulled me aside and told me how meaningful it would be if I could wear some of the clothes for the photo shoot. I wanted to resist, but having 3 generations of overbearing Asian women was too intimidating, and I agreed to it. They took me inside my great-grandmother's house, making me and Cassie carry a trunk full of clothing. Once inside, Cassie began digging through it, and each new discovery made the blood drain from my face. Her wedding dress from the 1930s was in the chest, but fortunately there was no discussion of me even wearing it. Instead, they went right to a midnight blue skirt suit from that same era. "He'll need some help to wear that." Auntie Lee smiled, and pulled out a corset worn decades before by my great-grandmother. I began protesting, but my great-grandmother just said, very matter-of-factly, "You need it for the shape." So Cassie and Auntie Lee made me take off my shorts and t-shirt and encased me in this terrible garment while my great-grandmother gave them instructions. "A little bit tighter," she kept saying, and Cassie would obediently yank on the laces in the back until I could hardly breathe. The corset went down over my butt, garter hooks dangling down and tickling my thighs, and it had pointy boob cups easily filled by my chest. My great-grandmother really had been as flat as me. My ears were burning hot with embarrassment and I had gone completely silent, but nobody seemed to notice. Cassie went to my great-grandmother's room and came back with stockings which she had me put on and hook to the garters. At the very least, because they were covered by the long corset, they let me keep my boxers on, my only remaining anchor of masculinity. One quickly fading away as Cassie told me to hold up my arms so she could drape a calf-length slip over my head. And then came the skirt suit, which Cassie and Auntie Lee helped me into. The skirt went down to my calves, tight the whole way. It had a row of buttons running up one side, and when I put the coat on, I discovered a matching row of buttons continuing all the way up to my neck and the ridiculously large shoulder pads. I could barely walk with the tightness of the skirt, and that wasn't helped when Cassie brought me a pair of her heels to wear. "I thought it was supposed to be authentic," I complained, finally seeing a way to stop it. "Aha!" Auntie Ollie cried out in victory, digging through the chest. I turned, stomach turning from anxiety and the tightness of the corset. She was holding forth a pair of brown leather shoes with a low heel and a big bow across the top of the foot. My feet were bigger than my great-grandmother's at the time, but only a little bit. Even though I tried to protest, the 3 women found a shoehorn and managed to get my feet into the shoes. Now tottering around, they laughed at me, finally seeming to notice the absurdity of what they were doing. Cassie gave me advice on how to walk like the most feminine of women, and I found that in heels and a tight skirt and a corset, swinging my hips and wiggling my butt and placing my feet daintily and carefully helped a lot. The ease it brought to my movements took a little of the sting out of the humiliation of mincing around like a girly girl, but not much. As I practiced walking, trying not to hyperventilate lest I faint, and beginning to sweat from the heavy fabrics worn in the summer heat, my great-grandmother went through Cassie's makeup to find appropriate shades for the era. Then I had to sit there as Cassie did my makeup. It took longer than I wanted, and by the end of it I was fidgeting, my eyes stinging from the fake eyelashes she had glued on, my cheeks itching and tickling where she has brushed on light blush, my lips sticky from bright red lipstick. Finally, it came time to have me stand and pose for examination, and I have to say, seeing the joy in my great-grandmother's face, seeing Auntie Lee step back and wipe tears from her eyes, it almost made it worth it. For a moment, just a moment, I was glad I had been able to do this for 2 of the matriarchs of our family. I had endured discomfort and embarrassment, and it had brought joy to these two women who had loved me and cared for me all my life. I felt a huge swell of pride, and the urge to hug them both, tears beginning to form in my own eyes. And then Auntie Lee broke the spell by saying, "She looks just like you." And just like that, all of the pride I took in enduring this for my older relatives was gone. The anxiety came roaring back, along with a helpless humiliation. I could do nothing to get myself out of this. The minor verbal protests I had put up were ignored or dismissed, and I couldn't resist lest I hurt my elders, whether that be emotionally or physically. And so, I was now a SHE. They had forgotten my status as a boy so completely that even someone who had known me my whole life automatically defaulted to thinking of me in feminine terms. I might as well have been another female grandchild like Cassie, just one lucky enough to fit into great-grandmother's clothing. Now I wanted to cry for a different reason. And then it came time to rejoin the others for the photo shoot. All of the other cousins were dressed in various outfits. I saw what some of the girls were wearing, and started feeling like I had gotten off lucky. A lot of them were dressed in poofy 50s dresses, admiring each other and playing with their layers of petticoats. My tomboy cousin, call her Kelly, my same age, looked almost as miserable as me in an outfit that looked like it was right out of the Old West, a white blouse with a high collar and puff sleeves, fastened with a brooch, and a long high-waisted skirt going down to the ground, flaring out from her corseted waist. Over one arm, she had a coat that she had taken off for the heat. I wanted nothing else than to rip off the jacket of my skirt suit, but beneath all I had on was a lacy slip and corset, and I didn't want anyone to see that. Everyone's attention turned to me as Cassie led me out. She warned them against laughing at me. She emphasized that I was doing a very kind, noble thing to help the family with our project. She called it a family project as if we were building a house together or something, but please remember, it was a spur-of-the-moment photo shoot, and everyone immediately crowded around me, drowning me in compliments and commendations. I know they were trying to make me feel better, but being called pretty, beautiful, being told I looked just like my great-grandmother at her peak, she had been considered an exotic beauty back in the day, before World War II fucked up our family, being complimented as if I was a girl didn't help how I felt at all. I mumbled thanks to everyone, and then drifted away from the main group as people began organizing the photo shoot. As I hung out alone, uncomfortable, humiliated, Kelly came up to me. "So they got you too, huh?" she said, which out of everything was the one thing that really made me feel better. She was treating me as a comrade, as a fellow victim. I knew that she hated being perceived as girly, yet here she was, an image of utter femininity. She was probably as uncomfortable as me, but getting way less sympathy from people. "Yeah," I said, shifting from heel to heel. "I have no idea how it even happened." "I know exactly how mine happened," Kelly said. "This was my mom's one big chance to see me all dolled up. But I got something out of it." "Yeah? What?" I asked, hoping she had convinced them to pay her and theorizing that I could probably talk my way into that as well. "They promised to let me shoot some of their vintage guns," she grinned. We talked like that for a few more minutes until she was summoned away to the old stables, where there would be a good Old West vibe. Right before they called her, her mom snapped a candid of us laughing together, and then irritated both of us by saying, "There's a picture of our two girls who hate being girls actually smiling." That photograph is framed in my grandmother's house, and it's honestly a really beautiful picture of two relatives getting along. I just wish it wasn't of me dressed up like a woman from the 1930s. People absolutely love talking about this picture to get a rise out of Kelly and me, and it's still embarrassing to both of us to this day. Anyway, Kelly started yelling at her as they went off to their location, leaving me back in the hands of Auntie Lee. She grabbed a stool to stand on, she's very short, to arrange my hair in an elegant cascade on one side of my face, and finished me off with a pillbox hat with a veil of delicate netting. She gave me a hand mirror, and upon looking at myself, I had to admit that everyone was right. I was pretty. The thought even acknowledging that made me knees feel weak, and I put the mirror down as quickly as I could without shattering it to pieces. The whole time, our family friend, like third-generation family friends, his family owned the ranch over the hill from my great-grandmother's, David was watching me curiously. He had proven to be a perfect fit for some of my great-grandfather's clothes, and so I was to be paired with him for a bunch of pictures with this old Ford pickup truck that still stood on the property, overgrown with weeds and rusting to pieces. The idea was to get a picture showing that some things decayed and others stayed the same, namely, David and I in the place of my great-grandparents. The people enduring while material possessions crumbled away. Auntie Lee instructed us on how to pose, taking careful attention with me to make sure that I gave off a feminine aura. Hands on my hips, one hip stuck out, or my elbows kept at my sides and my hands raised in dainty elegance. Every new pose, with David posing just like any average man right beside me, renewed my humiliation, but what could I do? Every time I tried to pose in any way other than hyperfemininity, Auntie Lee yelled at me about breaking the illusion. It was easier to just obey and get through it as quickly as possible. In our last pose, she had us close together, with David's arm around my waist, and me resting my head against his chest while we gazed off into the distance. The wind kept blowing my hair into my face, and Auntie Lee thought it was perfect, so she took picture after picture. One of these pictures is also in my grandmother's house. People don't talk about it as much as the one of me and Kelly, probably because it's a very romantic picture of two male, at least, at the time, cousins. The whole time I was resting my head against David's chest, I kept thinking about how I could hear his heartbeat. I kept thinking about how the feelings I was experiencing, the physical sensations of being dressed up and wearing makeup and being held by a strong, handsome Asian man in a 1930s suit, with suspenders, fedora, everything, it was all the exact sensations my great-grandmother would have felt. The wool coat that scratched at my made-up cheek was the same coat that would have scratched at hers as she held her husband. Needless to say, it all felt too weird to process. But in my inability to process it, I just get myself beginning to surrender to the scene we were playing out. The flood of pride I had felt earlier at seeing the joy in my aunties' and great-grandmother's faces returned, and I suddenly felt warm and safe. And all I could hear was David's heartbeat. It was only when Auntie Lee went, "All right, all done," and David hastily retreated from me that I remembered how creepy it all was. "Finally, that's over," I said, mostly to convince David that I hadn't had a weird moment of, for lack of a better term, feminine satisfaction. "Yeah," David said. "Kind of fun though. I feel like an old-school gangster. I just need a Tommy gun, right? And you can be my mall." His joke sent a wave of fear through me, and I struggled to respond with another joke. Fortunately, I spotted Kelly returning from her photo shoot and scurried off to meet her. It might have been my imagination, and I didn't look to confirm it, but I'm pretty sure I felt David's eyes watch me as I swayed and wiggled and daintily stepped away from him, my outfit forbidding me from running, forbidding me from reminding him that I wasn't the pretty girl everyone apparently wanted me to be. The humiliation of that retreat almost had me in tears before I met up with Kelly. Her bravado and anger helped me feel braver as well. "This is my worst freaking nightmare," Kelly said to me. "Come on, let's go get changed." I wasn't sure if anyone still wanted me dressed up, and certainly everyone else was content to remain in their historical clothing. Most of them, like David, seemed to think it was kinda cool. I felt the urge to rejoin the main group, to wait for David and then spend the rest of the afternoon teasing and flirting with him. But just as quickly I decided that was a terrible idea, and followed Kelly. Leading up to the house was a narrow walkway with railroad ties as steps. On the way down, Cassie had helped me navigate them, but now Kelly and I had to hold each other's hands and use each other for balance as we went. I had to take each step one at a time, twisting my knees to get me foot out and up, finding footing in my heels, and then stepping up with the other foot. Kelly, meanwhile, was forced to lift her skirts and petticoats at each step. At some point in our struggle, you guessed it, another picture was taken, to be displayed along with all the others in my grandmother's house. Again, the picture is compelling, two women helping each other up a set of stairs. If it weren't for the fact that both subjects are humiliated and angry, it would be kind of inspiring. Anyway, by the time we were halfway up, she was swearing up a storm and ranting about women's clothing. "It's all designed to fucking humiliate us. Look at me, I'm fucking helpless, and you wonder why everyone thought we shouldn't fucking vote. It's all designed to make us look like little ornaments that men get to fuck." And when she said us and we, I thought that she was talking about herself and women in general, but as she went on, it started seeming more and more like she was including me in it. The feeling only grew stronger when we got inside and went to the room she was sharing with her sisters, and immediately started changing in front of me. Socially, it felt like the kind of thing a girl would only do in front of another girl. I started undressing as well, thinking nothing of it because I just wanted out. I unbuttoned the jacket and took it off, carefully folding it and putting it on Kelly's bed. I noticed she wasn't being careful at all, and as I unbuttoned the skirt and wiggled it over my butt, she practically tore her blouse off and dropped it to the ground. At last, we were both in our corsets and underwear. Me in a slip, her in layers of petticoats, yellowed with age. "Who do you think got it worse?" she asked, looking me up and down. "How is that even a contest?" I said, "Obviously me. At least you're actually a girl." "Yeah, but as actually a girl I'm supposed to be so excited at this opportunity. You at least get the freedom to be embarrassed about it." She had made her point and turned around. "Now please get me out of this thing," she said. Part of me wanted to demand that she liberate me first, but I kinda agreed with her, so I settled for taking the slip off and going to help her. She loosened the drawstring of her petticoats to expose the full lacing on the corset, and I was suddenly glad I hadn't had to wear hers. It was much tighter, pinching her waist into an unnatural degree. After seeing that, I rushed to get her out, undoing the bow with a few rugs, and then loosening the laces until she could undo the clasps at the front. She picked up a sports bra from the floor and shrugged it over her head, then kicked herself out of the petticoats. "Okay, now me," I said, and turned around. Right as her fingers touched the knot on my corset, as I was practically trembling with anticipation to finally be able to breathe and move freely, there was a knock on the door. "Kitty, are you in there?" she said. "Tell her I'm not here," I whispered to Kelly, who smirked. "He's not here. Maybe some sex traffickers thought he was a real girl and kidnapped him." I reached out to punch her in the arm to get her to shut up, which made her cackle with laughter, which in turn convinced Auntie Lee to poke her head in. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "One more thing we need you for. Wait here, don't take that corset off." She scurried away, and I practically pleaded with Kelly to shelter me as a refugee, but Kelly knew better than to cross Auntie Lee, and so I could only sit on the bed and wait. It was only a few minutes later that Auntie Lee returned with a garment bag. She held it reverently. Kelly and I both approached her curiously, Kelly with more confidence than me now that she is back in her regular clothes. "Okay, you two, let's be quiet, we have a surprise for your great-grandmother." With a flourish, she unzipped the garment bag, revealing what was within. It was a dark green wool coat with shiny buttons. For a moment I didn't know what I was looking at. Kelly resized first, and gasped. I caught on soon after. "This is a uniform," I said. "Your great-grandmother was in the Women's Army Corps," Auntie Lee said. She was so proud to serve. As she spoke, she unpacked items from the garment bag, slipping the coat off a hanger, unfolding a khaki shirt and olive green skirt, restoring a crushed hat to its proper shape. "Earlier today, your uncle found your great-grandfather's uniform. David's putting it on now to surprise your great-grandmother. Just think of how happy it would make her to see you wear this." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove past Auntie Lee and run to the kitchen to get some scissors to cut myself free from this corset. I wanted to tell her, no, 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 no. But the memory of that swell of pride from earlier, the memory of David, my momentary urge to flirt with him, this would offer all of that on a much grander scale. "Auntie Lee, you can't make him do this," Kelly hissed at her. "Can't you see how miserable this is making him?" I was grateful for her defending me, for giving me an out, but I also get a sudden rush of fear that Kelly might stop this from happening. I shoved that fear aside, reminding myself of how uncomfortable I was. Of course Kelly was right. Of course I hated this. Auntie Lee ignored her and continued, "Are you going to make me tell your great-grandmother that you wouldn't do this for her? Will you have me say, 'Yes, look how handsome David is'?" We could have seen your uniform brought to life by one of your beloved great-grandchildren, but they simply refused. Is that what you want me to have to say? But isn't this stolen valor or something? I said, voice cracking with desperation. Nonsense. You're not trying to get anything from it. You're only trying to make your elders happy. Okay, I said, wincing at how much of a pushover I was. Okay, I'll do it. And so once again, I found myself dressing as a woman. The first thing Auntie Lee handed me almost made me back out of the deal. A pair of panties, the legs coming down to the mid-thigh. They almost looked like biking shorts, except for the material. I ran my fingers over the panties, hesitating. If I put them on, there would be no going back. Fuck it. I slipped my boxers off against my better judgment. Trying to suppress my shudders and shivers, I pulled the panties on, hiking them up over the corset to rest at my waistline. Then Auntie Lee had me take off my stockings only to replace them with a new set, these with a seam running up the back. Make sure that seam is straight, Auntie Lee said. Don't disrespect your great-grandmother. Then came another slip, this one far heavier, more substantial. It gathered nicely at the waist, and the gentle padding of the bodice helped neutralize the pointedness of the corset's built-in bra. The slip trailed down to just below my knees, leaving plenty of my stockings on display. As I turned to pick up the next item, the slip swayed around me, the momentum so electrifying that I almost lost my balance. I steadied myself and found Auntie Lee offering me a khaki blouse. As I took it and unbuttoned it, I caught Kelly's eye. We had been allies throughout this whole miserable experience, but now she looked at me with something close to despair. How could you let them do this to you? Her eyes seemed to say. I had to look away from her as I put the blouse on and buttoned it up. When I was finished, I realized that the shirt was cut to emphasize my boobs and narrow waist. Then came a dark skirt, which I buttoned around my corseted waist, horrified, perhaps delighted, to find that it fit almost perfectly. While I swayed back and forth, quivering at the feeling, I was still unsure if it was fear or excitement. Auntie Lee handed me a tie the same color as the skirt and coat. Do you know how to tie a four-in-hand? A what? I said. I know how, Kelly sighed. She took my hand and led me to a mirror, where she stood behind me and with a few deft gestures executed a beautiful knot. I was too distracted by my appearance to notice as she slipped away, leaving me alone with my reflection. I had been uncomfortable in the 1930s skirt suit, but seeing myself reflected back like this, wearing such a recognizable uniform, so fastidiously assembled, so prim and perfect, shattered something within me. Once again, that pride swelled, memories of nearly swooning in David's arms. The swelling seemed to fill my heart, and when I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, I also felt every bit of clothing pressing in on me. At my neck, the fully buttoned collar of my blouse. Around my chest, a corset, the padded bodice of the slip, the blouse perfectly framing the gentle curve where my breasts would be, where my breasts were, by all appearances. Around my waist, the tight confines of the corset, for which I was suddenly flooded with gratitude. Gratitude? Where has that come from? Why was I suddenly so glad? The anxiety returned and the blissful sensations of constriction I had found so luxurious vanished. I was still in that bewildered state, trying desperately to return to my momentary bliss when Auntie Lee ambushed me from behind. She secured a tall, round hat to my head, and then, as I turned in shock to confront her, thrust a coat sleeve around one of my dangling arms. With surprising dexterity, she twisted my other arm back before I could resist and slipped the coat the rest of the way on. The pose forced me to push my chest out, strengthening the illusion that I had boobs swelling from my chest. Desperate to hide them, I pulled the coat tightly around me, taking refuge in its thickness. Hastily, I buttoned it up, hoping it might hide my newly feminine figure. But as the figure-hugging coat took shape around me, it only reinforced it. While my shape without the coat was almost excessively feminine, with a prominent bust, a narrow waist, and a flaring skirt, it had become something more subtle. Each curve of my body, from my breasts to my waist to my hips, was now smooth and soft and gentle. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw myself as I never had before. I took another deep breath and resumed my catalog of constrictions. I felt gratitude for the corset and accepted it. I felt the panties pinning my masculine appendage up against my crotch, but found that it wasn't painful. Around my knees, I felt the weight of the wool skirt pressing the slip against me, inviting it to slide against my stockings. I glanced over my shoulder and raised my calf to check my seams. I tugged them into place where necessary, reveling in the sensation of utter confinement. All of it felt natural, all of it made this flow better, just like how swaying my hips had helped me walk more easily when I had been forced into the skirt suit. "You need shoes," Auntie Lee reminded me, and of course she had shoes ready to go. These shoes had laces, and I was able to slip them on easily and knot them tight. As I rose, I checked my stockings again, and then smoothed my skirt out, wiggling back and forth to make sure it wasn't caught on the slip. Sure enough, I felt the hem behind me come free and drop down, tugging on my waist ever so slightly. The wiggle sent the skirt and slip swinging around my waist, coiling around my legs. "How do you feel?" Auntie Lee said. "You look," Kelly began, and then stopped. I feel nice," I said, and was surprised to hear my voice so honest and gentle. "You look radiant," Kelly said. "No joke, you're glowing." I looked at myself once more in the mirror, eyelashes still thick and dark, cheeks still rosy, lips still red. I caught Kelly's eye in the mirror and smiled. When I had been in David's arms, I had noticed this warmth, labeled it feminine satisfaction. What did it mean that I had run from it? What did it mean to embrace it now? "I'm just doing this to make our great-grandmother happy," I said, trying to cover for it, but unable to stop smiling. "And that makes me happy." I'm not sure anyone in the room believed me. David was brought to my room, and we examined each other, curiously, cautiously. I wondered if his experience of putting on the World War II uniform of his grandfather had been as intense as mine. Whatever the case, neither of us spoke a word about it. We were content to let Auntie Lee stage the surprise. Under much secrecy and plotting and planning, we were sent out the back door, and then traipsed through the side yard to get back to the front. The pathway was narrow, a treacherous tangle of roots hidden beneath a carpet of dead leaves. David took the lead, testing the ground with his shiny shoes, hat tucked under his arm. Again, the sight of him seemed to transport me. He seemed suddenly more masculine than he ever had before, more confident, more sure of himself. He looked over his shoulder, and a stray strand of hair fell into his eyes. He swept it back into his 1940s coif with a smooth motion and smiled at me. "It's all right," he said, "just step where I step." And so, I took his hand and followed him, breathless from the corset, and the warmth of his soft fingertips gently gripping mine. The pride came again, that feminine satisfaction, and this time, I rode it like a wave. From the breathlessness came a sudden rush of air as I remembered to breathe deeply, to feel the constrictions and be thankful for them. With each step, I felt the panties rubbing against the head of my cock, and with each breath, my gratitude focused on my panties. How horrible it would be to have my cock erect and visible for everyone to see. How much better it was to keep my arousal contained, secret, so that even as David kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes darting up and down my body, drinking in every gentle, feminine curve, he could never know how I felt unless I told him, or did as I suddenly yearned to and leapt into his arms and begged him to kiss me. A stray leaf got caught in my nylons, and without thinking, in a breathy voice, I let out an, "Oh, no." Just like a girl. How natural it all seemed. How easily it all came to me. At any other time, that thought would have sent me spiraling into despair, sent me reeling and retching with anxiety, but the uniform seemed to contain all of that. The layer upon layer I was wearing, so inappropriate for the summer heat, reminded me exactly of where I was, of what I was doing. I had no choice but to accept it, and in accepting the utter femininity of my situation, and dwelling within it rather than trying to escape it, I had found an ecstasy like I had never known. It was the pure bliss of yielding, of allowing what was happening to happen, of letting David take the lead, when I would usually be so eager to prove myself and forge on ahead. Wasn't this better? To be led by the hand, to be gentle and soft, to submit utterly to things inescapable? Yes, I decided. It had to be. Yes. 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 David kept leading me forward until my stockings were full of leaves, all prickling at my ankles. When we arrived on the porch, he kept hold of my hand and drew me towards my great-grandmother's favorite rocking chair. I sat, automatically smoothing my skirt beneath me with my other hand. David knelt before me, and I clamped my knees together, stricken with terror, once again breathless. Was he trying to see my panties? What was he thinking? But he only began picking the leaves from my nylons, careful not to tear them. The simple act of service almost made me melt. My cock ached, not with the desire to fill something, but with the desire to be filled. I want to pull David onto me. I wanted to lift my skirt up, to give him access to everything. Everything I had was his. But I had to resist. I had to sit there, breathing steadily and quietly and trying to quiet the tremors that ran through my legs every time his fingers delicately traced across my ankles, brushing each leaf free with a single motion. When I was clean, I took a moment to compose myself, to remind myself that I was a lady, not some cock-hungry beast. I readjusted my seams, and stood. Okay, so we just ring the doorbell, he said. Yes, I said, my voice once again breathy, pitched higher. He smiled at that, not a mocking smirk. A gentle smile. He rang the doorbell. I straightened my skirt. He did the same with his tie. He put his hat on his head, and then held an arm out for me to take. I did so without hesitation, and leaned on him, let myself draw close to him, let the curves of my body fit perfectly against the geometries of his. From within, we heard my great-grandmother grumbling. I have to answer the door now? Me? Don't we have young people who can do this kind of thing? And then the door opened. Oh, she said, and looked at us for a long moment, mouth open in a small circle. She took a step back, and slowly raised a hand to cover her mouth. Oh, look at you, she said. Look at you both. And then no more words, as she was lost in tears, waving us forward to embrace us. As she squeezed me tight to her, I felt my own tears beginning to fall. All day, they had formed and threatened a storm that had not yet broken. Now it broke, but the force behind them was not humiliation, not anger, not resentment, it was simply joy. Now I realized I had not been lying. I was doing this to make my great-grandmother happy, and seeing her happy truly brought me joy. The tears spilled, silently, and I suddenly began to worry about my makeup. Another feminine urge, emerging so naturally from somewhere within me. Humiliation threatened to rear its head, so I squeezed my great-grandmother tighter, and reached an arm around David to embrace him as well. His arm looped around my shoulders, one final squeeze, and then we all broke apart. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I found myself sitting on the floor, legs daintily to one side, ankles crossed, with my skirt draped modestly over my knees. My great-grandmother shared stories about her time in World War II, and the family gathered to listen. Most of the youth had remained dressed in their historical clothing, and looking around my great-grandmother's living room took on the appearance of a bizarre time-displaced Asian Norman Rockwell painting. Even Kelly managed to find a suit of men's clothes that she fashioned into a pretty badass look. She sat near me, eyes full of curiosity. The attention swirled and ebbed and flowed, but always seemed to return to me. The simple act of wearing my great-grandmother's clothing had transformed me into her obvious favorite, and there was something like respect being afforded to me. Towards the end of the day, David and I were subjected to another round of photographs. We walked around the ranch arm in arm, hand in hand, and I once again found myself embracing feminine satisfaction. I yielded wherever and whenever there was room to yield, and David never hesitated to take the lead. The night ended with our final photograph. I have this one, stolen from my grandmother's photo wall. We're in the old barn, holding each other in a slow dance beneath twinkling fairy lights beside a piano that had not been in tune since before I was born.